Okay, in this video, I'd like to briefly go over the midterm case study and your answers. And the big question here will be how well or did you at all use intersectional analysis? Now, I purposely kept this assignment equal to the same number of points as the previous assignments because I didn't want you to worry or stress out about it because this was going to be one of the hardest assignments. So even if you got a lower grade than you would have liked, it won't have a dramatic impact on your final grade. But it should give you a sense of how well are you able to apply the things that you were supposed to have learned from weeks 1 to 3, and what will you need to focus on for the remaining assignments and the final exam. And I encourage everyone to consider doing extra credit, especially the extra credit that is in the workbook from page 35 to 37, because as you'll see, the answers weren't great. There were some okay answers. There were some very incomplete answers, and then most of you are just struggling to try to apply the concepts, which is what I expect. But I want to try to help you turn that corner and to be able to do it, relatively quickly because this is the 6-week express course. So this slide here just shows you had a lot of stuff that you had to think about, even though it was only really 3 questions, right? The 3 questions were talking about racial capitalism, cultural differences, and norms, right? So in theory, right, if you look at your outline, that doesn't seem like it's a lot, but then when you kind of get into the concepts here and then the resources, you've got a lot that you had to really try to learn. So let me pull out some of the big things that you needed to focus on in order to do well on this midterm. A lot of students, this is very common, it's not just students, a lot of people, they think slavery is something that is an ancient history that happened thousands of years ago when the dinosaurs roamed, and then now it's all over. This is completely inaccurate, but it's also it really keeps you from seeing reality, and especially how social difference still operates today within that binary or 0 and 1 of superior, inferior. And so slavery is reproduced as a concept over and over and over again. And what you needed to see in the workbook reading was that because there's an economic motive for that, there's a profit to get out of that. And so gentrification is not just the displacement of people of color in neighborhoods. That's part of it, but people wouldn't do that if there wasn't an economic profit in it, right? So, and there's not a social cost. People don't say, whoa, you can't do this. They try, right? They try to organize, but the profit value or the values and the norms that we have in this society that have been built over racial capitalism, generation after generation, values economic development over the rights of individuals. And so you have to really grasp that in order to understand a class like constitutional law. In theory, you would have learned that in classes before you took this class, but just in case you haven't learned that, you might still be thinking a little bit of a childish notion of you have rights, that those are yours. It's like your teddy bear, or it's like your blanket, right? It's a nice thing to think. It's like I said in the review video, the 3-week review video. It's not a bad thing for parents and teachers to tell their kids when they're little. But now that you're an adult and you're doing constitutional analysis, it's time to be realistic. The economic system really doesn't reward individual rights. You don't get any money for having individual rights. You do get money for discriminating against people's rights. And so you've got to be able to see that that's the environment, or that's the situation that we're all in. And the 2 resources that are current, right, was the video Uneven Growth, and then the map, the eviction mapping work, and the segregation mapping. And so you see those things kind of coming together, and that gives you what's called empirical evidence, or the facts, right, the social facts that show us that this is the reality that we're in. Now that's the economic system, but you also want to think about the cultural system. So, sometimes I realize that not everybody has a definition for culture. Maybe you haven't talked about it in a class that's talked about that. I give a few examples here, right? Beliefs, religion, language, fashion, music, things that people kind of consider lifestyle. Now, it's not individual though, and it's not just your family, right? There's what one student said, there's the mistaken American culture, right? The fact that we can say that there's an American culture and that it doesn't apply to everybody tells us that people think there's an American culture. And so what about that culture, right? What about that mistaken perception? How does that affect people? So in order to understand that, you have to break groups up into at least two groups. There's probably a lot more than two, but if you can't break them up into at least two, then you're really kind of missing the point. So if you're only thinking about your situation or the world that you live in, and you're not thinking about the entirety of the United States government, you probably wouldn't be able to understand most of the political things that are going on. But in general, you want to think about it this way, if I can help you think about it this way, is that you've got a majority population that has a majority culture and has a majority set of beliefs. This is generally not pop culture, right? The largest political party with the most voters does not tend to like the music that you like most likely. They don't tend to be in cities. They don't tend to be in the urban environment. They don't tend to be very diverse. And so that majority culture is the dominant culture because that's who the politicians are. That's who the business owners are. That's who law enforcement tend to be across the country. Again, so you got to see beyond New York City. You got to see the entirety of the national culture. And if you're looking for examples of this, right, you'd have to do some pretty deep research. This isn't going to be something that you're going to find on Wikipedia or a Google search or YouTube. You're going to have to read studies where you're looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of interviews or what are surveys, data. And so, I understand why this is a new way of thinking, but you got to try to understand this class. You have to understand this majority culture because it's really, really evident in the legal system. And then the one you're probably more used to, or any of us living in New York City are used to, is this more minority culture or countercultures. And those tend to fall into two categories, as you probably have common experience in. There's people who submit to the majority culture. Maybe they retain a little bit of their cultural identity, but they generally try to become quote unquote more American. Or, in some instances, people would say more white. On the other hand, you have people who resist those cultures, and that's really what counterculture is all about. And so, these are things that all of us can see and experience here in New York City. When you go to, some part of Kansas or North Dakota, you're not going to see very much resistance. You're not going to see very much counterculture, if at all. And so you want to keep that in mind, that again, within that majority culture, there's pockets of resistance. And so that's why I added this phrase, pluralities, right? There's not just two cultures. There's probably dozens of cultures, but they're all competing in a space where one culture gets kind of put to the front. And there's lots of pop culture references you can see with this struggle, right, of what proper language is, right? Or, what some people say is, should I be able to speak one way in one environment and another? There's lots of debate about that. What religion should be practiced in a certain area, what content should be taught in schools, right? These are all these struggles that are going on. It's really the majority culture saying, well, it has to be our way. And then the pluralities are saying, well, what about us? And so what I was hoping that you'd be able to do then is you see that white middle class culture is being referenced here in two different legal situations, one in policing and then one in the Court of Appeals here in New York City, when it comes to what they're calling high crime or low economic zones. And so there's already kind of a judgment being made by the middle class saying that, well, there's going to be all these stereotypes, all these problems that are going to occur simply because these people are different. They're not really quote unquote American. And so then you see why this then leads to kind of this circular process of where racial capitalism comes in again, is that you've got this economic incentive to treat people differently. The cultural majority then sees people who are not like them as weaker or inferior. And so then it's just really easy then for the system to discriminate on race, gender, and class. And so I gave you 3 readings, The Power of Self-Definition, Confronting Class, and All Eyes Are on You, in order for you to better understand what that means, right? What does race, gender, and class mean? And all 3 of them are intersectional, so they bring the 3 together so that you can see that these tend to happen at the same time. They don't always happen at the same time. You might not have experienced all of them, or maybe you weren't thinking about it in this way. But this intersectionality tends to be targeted by the cultural majority most often. And then in the 3-week review video, I gave you 3 really core concepts that I was hoping to see on the midterm, which one is that you'd really talk about mobilized systematic bias, where the profit and the white hetero preferences are really making it much harder for X just to survive in the system, right? The X doesn't have any rights because they're not conforming. There's also, I want you to see the belief bias, that you might think you're not biased, you might think you're not discriminating, but if you live in the system, then unless you're actively resisting, unless you're in a collective group and you're trying to bring down these hierarchies, you're participating, you're complicit. And so your belief bias is like all of our belief bias, right? The majority views are really hard not to get into our heads. And so unless you're actively resisting it and really thinking about which voices are being excluded. And so you hear in the hypo, right, that X really never has a space where their voice is being included. And so it's always them having to struggle against this majority belief system. And so that really should have led you to understand that the system produces domination, not individuals. And so that means that people who are targeted, race, class, and gender, they have to make the decision of resistance or, right, one student suggested they just simply move. That's not a good strategy if you could think about it, because there's no guarantee that the next city is going to be better or the next place is going to be better. Most of you suggest that they work harder, which is then going back to that submission, right? Submit to the system, just go with it. If you can't beat them, join them kind of idea. Now, none of these are wrong, but those aren't really in the self-interest of X here, right? The self-interest would be to change the system. In other words, if you want equality or if you want equal opportunity of rights, then the system would have to change, not the individuals in the system. So I want to give you 3 good answers to each of the questions and talk about why they're good and maybe talk about what you might not have been doing. This is a good formula that the student used here, which is the values are derived from the racial identities. And what this really should mean, I hope this is what the student meant, but what this should mean is that the values that society, right, that we are making is based on these constructed identities. These aren't real. Race is not a real biological thing. It's a social construction. And so what we're doing is we're attributing value to the color of someone's skin or the way they speak or what country they're from or where they immigrated from. And these aren't scientific values. These are our belief systems. And so the real issue here is that they didn't receive treatment that's equal, even though they're supposed to be human rights, right? There's this idea that we're supposed to be treated equally, but in reality, that's not really happening. And the economic system here shows us that it's the landlord, of course, is going to give excuses because they get 2 benefits. One, they get the profit benefit, they get the economic money from it, but then they also get the social benefit. They get the social benefit of saying, well, I'm going to go along with these values that are derived from the racial identities. So this is a really good analysis here where they're applying race and class, right? It's missing gender here, but that's okay. 2 out of 3, as they say in baseball, ain't bad. The next one really, again, is talking about unequal access, but this really gets good at now understanding the system of majority, right? That the majority system is really feeding into these beliefs that basically mostly white people are going to have certain expectations and predictions about Black people in particular that aren't accurate, but that those predictions and that belief system is what creates a system, a structure that makes it very difficult for people of color, for people with a non-gender conforming identity, with women, right? It makes them very difficult. That's the situation, right? It's not individual beliefs. It's not just the librarian, right? She might be a bad person. She might be a quote unquote good person. But the system is promoting her to continue to discriminate. And it's doing this through this belief system of inferiority and superiority. And so again, right, cultural differences really go to the majority culture versus the pluralities, right? The majority culture is getting away with stereotypes because they don't have to challenge or experience the world in any different way. And so this kind of feeds into this cycle or a circle. Now, this last example is about norms, and this is tough. I mean, this is the only student who actually focused on norms. Most of you focused on X, which doesn't really make sense the way the question was asked, right? The question was about norms. And what I'm getting at here is that there's an idea in some... Sorry about that. So there's an idea in certain textbooks. That laws are norms, and that really doesn't make any sense here. And most of you confirmed that for me because you didn't talk about norms at all. But the issue here would be that what I want to bring up here is that the idea that maybe this student really highlighted something I think is interesting, which is, well, this white lady who is not minding her business, your norm, right, and I would agree with you, is that she should be minding her business. But it could be, and I would confirm this, in certain cultures, in the white majority middle class culture, not minding your business is not a thing, right? There is a social benefit to going around and bossing people around, especially in a position of power like that in the library. And so you might see people, white people from middle class backgrounds, for example, who speak out, that they speak up. And a couple students mentioned this, but just not in this context. So here we have conflicting norms, right? We have one set of norms, which is minding your business, and the other one, which is basically bossing people around. And then the student sees how this is how stereotypes feed in, right? So if the cultural norm is to boss people around, especially if you think they're inferior, then the stereotypes are really feeding into this norm of interfering with other people's lives. And this is really what we're trying to get at here, is that that cultural view or that norm process system of interfering with people's lives for violating their rights, quote unquote, for the social good, that is broken windows policing theory. That is the Callahan versus Carey case. So some norms right here can be in competition in the struggle. And our norms here in the city are going to be different than the national norms. And that's that question about, New York culture versus American culture, and really trying to unpack that and really think about it. So, this is the challenge here, is that norms are a system, right? They're not held by the individual. They're kind of almost like you want to think about them as floating around, right? The easiest way, if you really want to analyze norms well, I think, is to watch commercials and start just analyzing what is the message that this commercial is trying to put out there, and then count them. How many times did they really promote this idea? And you'll start to hear certain patterns. So now I just want to do briefly an intersectional analysis. I'm going to model what I was expecting of your student answers. Now, granted, I can see all of the answers and you only know your answer, right? But the issue here is that, let me give you one example, and this is not judging anyone. I'm just showing you how pervasive middle-class white heteronormative norms are. There was no evidence whatsoever in the case study of he or she, yet most of you tended to use those words he or she, even though I used they. And so you filled in your own gender and sexuality categories based on this mobilized bias, right? There's the expectation that in society that there's a value associated with he and she, right? And people treat people differently based on that value system. So people who exhibit they are they're a counter narrative, they're resisting that majority value system. And so I just wanted to show you that that's one example. So most of you did that, right? So you evidenced mobilized bias in your answers. And so this means that you have to be really doubly careful of learning about the content, but also reflecting upon your own biases, right? And we all have biases, and so we have to think about how we're being influenced. The second one is that, another interesting for me and the work I do, is the advice you offered in the fourth question tended to support the hard work narrative of white middle class men that kind of goes back to like Puritanism, which really, there was a couple students I applaud for saying that really wouldn't work, right? That these platitudes of work harder really aren't going to change the system. They're not going to change the structure, and that's what needs to change. So X doesn't need to change. X is hard work or less hard work, or right. That's not the problem here. It's that the system is promoting discrimination. It's not promoting equality. And so, it again, look at that mobilized bias of how the middle class values kind of circulate, even though they work against your interests and the interests of X in this particular case. Now, this is a constant struggle after teaching this class for 13 years. Students really struggle with this contradiction of rights being automatic or ideal versus the reality of exclusion and discrimination. Now, most students that I've worked with have experienced exclusion and discrimination. So if that's happened to you, then this contradiction is a little bit easier to resolve, right? You say, the world would be nice if it was this way, but in reality, this is how people behave. And then you're at a good position to start thinking about, so what's the purpose of having rights or ideal laws that don't really happen? Who does that benefit? And then you might want to learn more about the history of that. But for those of you who haven't really experienced exclusion and discrimination, you're kind of the example that we really would like to study and was a lot easier to do in the classroom, where you're reproducing those same expectations of there being an ideal law, that rights are equal to everyone, even though the majority of your peers are saying that doesn't happen to them in their daily life, and it doesn't happen to X in this situation. So yes, there was lots of violations of law, but this is a very common example. Human Rights Watch just released a study out this last weekend that this is the majority of people in New York City are treated this way. So to simply suggest that they file a lawsuit or they go to, some people I guess wanted to bring a criminal complaint, even though this isn't a criminal law violation. Denying a housing voucher isn't a criminal law, it's a civil law. Which means they can't go to jail for it, is not realistic, right? That the majority of people, majority of landlords are denying or are breaking the law. So if everyone's breaking the law, it's not realistic to think you're going to enforce that law. And so again, this is going between that contradiction between rights being automatic, that they're almost like magic, that come in and save you, and how are really people behaving? Because a legal system needs to respond to how people are really behaving, not a magical fantasy world. And so I provided a picture here just so you could start to see the social, right? We want you to look at structures, not individuals. So I'm hoping that like in a picture like this, the dog is just as important as the stoplight, is just as important as the birds, as the building, as the airplane, right? That the intersection, and the people are a part of that system. And so, people walk in the crosswalk or don't because the system encourages them or punishes them not to. And so that's what you want to be thinking about here is the crosswalk is like equality. It's like the rights, right? That's the ideal situation. Ideally, everyone would walk across the crosswalk at the appropriate time, and ideally, no drivers would ever run through a red light and hit people, right? Ideally, all of these things would happen. But in reality, people are people. And so they're going to respond to a system in which they're rewarded. And so if there's rewards for jaywalking, which of course in New York City there are, you get there faster, right? There's all these kind of things that happen. And there's not really any consequences, right? There's no social cost. Now, consequences doesn't mean jail, right? It means social costs. If everyone thinks it's okay and everybody goes along with it, then people are going to continue to do that. And so if you have a norm in the society where it's okay to treat people of color differently and discriminate and to see them as inferior, and the same thing with non-conforming gender folks, then people are going to do it because the social environment is telling them it's okay. That's really where we're trying to get you to start thinking so that you have a more accurate view of how a system works as opposed to what would be like good for maybe a religion class, how people should behave in an ideal world or the next world. So these are the few ideas just for you to focus on so you can do better on the final exam and your final assignments is move away from individual narratives. Try really hard to stop focusing on individuals and think about larger groups, including the majority group, minority groups, and the pluralities, right? And think about this as domination and resistance. So the other thing is I was a little disappointed that almost no students applied the reading materials and the course materials, the videos, right, that you've been studying. This is kind of surprising, right, in a way, because it's an assignment where you need to show me that you understand the course materials in order to pass the class. If you're not doing that, you may understand them, but I don't have any way of knowing that. The other thing you need to show me is that a system is not individual beliefs, choices, or stereotypes. Most of you focused on this, and so you're still kind of getting this wrong. You need to think about a system as rewards and costs. And so profit is what is rewarded, dignity or treating people equally is not. And so you need to just face that reality and be able to do your analysis for law, right? We're doing a legal analysis, not a religious or social good, right? We're not talking about what we want the world to be like. We're talking about how the world really is. Now, this doesn't mean that people have to behave this way. If the system was changed, then people would behave differently. But as long as you have a system that focuses on economic profit, then that's how people are going to behave. Now, the other thing is that history is important. So things now are not better or worse than they were before. They're either reproduced, we either do the same things that have been done for hundreds and thousands of years, or resist those things, right? It's because mom passes it down to daughter, to son, to et cetera, to et cetera, to et cetera, right? It goes reproduced. That's how we learn values, how we learn norms. So people have to break that history. So if people just keep thinking that people are inferior or superior, then that's how people are going to behave. You have to resist that. And so you want to think about the role of education, the legal system, the criminal justice system. How can this all be worked to actually change? You need to examine your own beliefs, norms, stereotypes, and what you think laws should do. You should spend the next week or so doing that as you're reading the readings. Really write down what's the difference between what you think and then what you're seeing in the readings. They're going to be very different, and so you need to be able to identify that. That's going to be the key for the final exam. And then you need to use the workbook. I made it for you. There are extra credit assignments along the way that will help you. I was also very disappointed. I didn't see a lot of the legal language, which means most of you don't seem to be using the workbook. Only 2 students have done the extra credit assignments from that workbook. Part of it is that, as one student suggested, there should be a reading comprehension quiz. Well, there is in 2 ways, right? Those extra credits really are the same thing. It shows me whether you're able to use the legal language that you just learned. So most of you, I would suggest, you can't read a reading and then understand and use the legal language from that reading. So the workbook breaks it up for you and it provides definitions. And so then I think that will be a little bit easier for you to do. Now, I'm not holding you to the highest possible standard here, right? I'm just you should be struggling with the language, and you should be struggling with the concepts. That's better than not talking about them at all. And so I'm hoping that you'll start to do that, that you'll watch the legal narrative video, that you'll watch this video, that maybe you go back and watch the 3-week video again, and that you really kind of prepare for the final exam the same way you would do if we were in person, that you really need to spend some time with these concepts. And the next 2 weeks of readings are fairly difficult. And so I want you to take really good notes and, again, compare those narratives to what your legal narrative is and really come up with what is your expectation of law? What do you think it's supposed to do? And is it kind of that naive, childish idea of it's something you possess, something that you have, they're your rights, and you're going to use them, right? As if it was like I don't know, a sword is what I kind of tend to think of. You're going to use it as a sword to defend yourself against all others, or is it part of a system, right? And so your rights only matter so much as the social environment if they care about it. So it's obviously not a sword, right? It's a language, it's a way of speaking. And if people don't really have the same narrative as you, then you need to understand, well, how does that affect your rights? And so that's what we're really looking for in the last 2 weeks. So I hope this is helpful, and I hope this helps students really focus on the final exam.